We're not animals, Sonny. That's first of all. Next, he said, raising his finger, what you're proposing, it would turn all the families against us, which, Sonny, would ensure our doom. Pop, start a zit! Vito pulled a chair up next to Sonny. Listen to me, he said, and he put a hand on Sonny's knee. There's going to be trouble now. Serious trouble. Not a child's game. There's going to be blood spilled. Sonny, do you understand? Sure, Pop, I understand. Vito said, I don't think you do. He looked away and ran his knuckles along his jaw. I've got to be thinking about everyone, Santino. About Tessio and Clemenza and their men, and all their families. I'm responsible, he said, and then paused, looking for the right words. I'm responsible for everyone, he said. For our whole organization. For everybody. Sure, Sonny said, and he scratched his head, wishing he could come up with a way to make his father believe that he understood him. What I'm saying, Vito said, and he yanked at his ear. You have to learn to listen, not just to what's said, but to what's meant. I'm telling you I'm responsible for everyone, Santino. For everyone. Sonny nodded and for the first time realized that he perhaps didn't understand what his father was trying to tell him. I need you to do what you're told, Vito said, again articulating each word as if talking to a child. I need you to do what you're told and only what you're told. I can't be worried about what hot-headed thing you're gonna do or say, Sonny. Here you are now, he said, a part of my business, and I'm telling you, Santino, you are to do nothing or say nothing unless you're told by me or Tessio or Clemenza. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, I think so, Sonny said, and he gave himself another second to consider it. You don't want me getting in the way. You're telling me you got important business to concentrate on and you can't be worrying about me doing something stupid. Ah, Vito said, and he pantomimed clapping. Under the street lamp on the corner of Patty's, Pete Murray executed an elaborate bow, including a twisting flourish with his extended left arm. A stout, older woman in an ankle-length dress put her hands on her hips, threw her head back and laughed before she sauntered off haughtily, turned to throw a glance at Pete and said something that made him bellow with laughter. Cork watched this scene unfold as he parked across the street behind a knife sharpener's wagon, the big grinding wheel bolted to the wagon bed. It was mid-morning still, the day awash in bright spring sunlight. All through the city, people were digging their lightweight jackets out of the back of the closet and storing away winter clothes. Cork stepped out of the car and yelled to Pete as he hurried to the corner. Pete greeted Cork with a smile. Glad you decided to join us, he said, and he clapped a burly arm around Cork's shoulder. Sure, Cork said. When Pete Murray asks me to have a beer, you know I don't think twice. Attaboy. How's Eileen and the little girl? They're doing good, Cork said. Bakery's thriving. Folks will always find a few pennies for a sweet, Pete said, even in a depression. He turned to Cork with an expression full of sympathy. Crying shame about Jimmy. He was a good lad and a smart one, too. As if he didn't want to linger on that bit of sadness, he added, But your whole family's like that, isn't it? He good-naturedly shook Cork by the shoulder. You've got the brains in the neighborhood. I don't know about that. They were a couple of doors down from Patty's, and Cork touched Pete's arm to stop him. On the street, a green and white police car slowed down, and a copper stared out the window at Cork, as if making a mental note of his face. Pete tipped his hat to him, the copper nodded, and the car rolled on down the block. Say, Pete, Cork asked once the police car passed by, Would you mind telling me what this is about? It's not every day I'm asked to have a beer with Pete Murray, and at 11 in the morning, I'll admit to being curious. Will ya? Pete said. He put his hand on Cork's back and directed him to Paddy's. Let's say I'd like to make you an invitation. An invitation to what? You'll see in a minute. As they neared the entrance to Paddy's, Pete stopped and said, You're not running with Sonny Corleone and his boys anymore. That's right, isn't it? When Cork didn't deny it, he said, I hear they tossed you out like a bum, while the rest of the boys are pulling in big dough with the Corleones. What's all that got to do with anything? In a minute, Pete said, and he pushed open the door to Paddy's. Except for 5 men sitting around the bar, Paddy's was empty, the chairs all upside down on tables, the floor swept clean. Daylight through a block glass window that looked out onto a side street and bright sunlight seeping into the bar room around the edges of pulled green curtains provided the only illumination. The space was still chilly from the night's cold. As always, it smelled of beer. The men at the bar all turned to look at Cork as he entered the room, though no one called out his name. Cork knew them all at a glance. The Donnelly brothers, Rick and Billy, seated side by side, Cor Gibson at the front of the bar next to Sean O'Rourke, and Stevie Dwyer by himself at the corner. With his back turned to the men in the process of locking the door, Pete said, You all know Bobby Corcoran. He put his arm around Cork's shoulder, led him to a seat at the bar, and pulled up a stool beside him. With the others watching and waiting, he reached for a couple of beer mugs and poured beers for himself and Cork. He was wearing a pale green shirt, blousy and loose-fitting over his gut, but tight around his chest and the bulging muscles of his arms. Let me get straight to the point, he boomed, once he slid Cork his beer. He slapped his big hands down on the bar for an extra jolt of emphasis and looked from face to face, as if assuring himself he had everyone's undivided attention. The Rosato brothers have made us a proposition. The Rosato brothers? Stevie Dwyer yelled. He sat with his arms crossed on the bar, lifting himself up in an effort to make himself a little taller. Jesus Christ, he muttered, and then was quiet as Pete and everyone else glared at him. The Rosato brothers have made us a proposition, Pete repeated. They want us to work for them. Oh, Jesus, Stevie murmured. Stevie, Pete said, will you let me speak, for Christ's sake? Stevie lifted a beer mug to his mouth and was quiet by way of an answer. Pete undid a button at his collar and looked down into his beer, as if having to gather his thoughts again after being interrupted. All the businesses we used to run in our neighborhoods, he said. We'll be running them again, though of course kicking up a share of the profits, as is only to be expected. Before Pete could continue, Billy Donnelly jumped in. And how would the Rosato brothers be delivering on that malarkey, Pete, given it's the Corleones in charge around here now? Ah, well, Pete said. Now, that's the real point of this little get-together, isn't it? So that's it, is it? Cor said, one hand tight around the knot of his shillelagh. The Rosatos are moving on the Corleones. The Rosatos aren't doing a blessed thing on their own, Rick Donnelly said. If the Rosatos are coming to us, they're talking for Mariposa. Of course, Pete said, raising his voice in annoyance and dismissing Rick's addition to the conversation as a waste of time repeating the obvious. Ah, for the love of God! Sean O'Rourke slid his beer away from him. He sounded disgusted and heartsick. In the silence that followed his outburst, Cork noticed how much Sean had changed since the last time he'd seen him. Much of his youth and handsomeness seemed to have been drained away, leaving him looking older and angrier, his face drawn and tight. You're not saying they want us to go up against the Corleones, are you now, Pete? Rick Donnelly pushed his stool back from the bar and looked at Pete as if he might be insane. That would be nothing but suicide for sure. They haven't asked us to do anything yet, Rick. Pete tilted his beer back and drained half of it as if he'd come to the point where he needed a drink to keep from losing his temper. They've made us a proposition. Come to work for them and we'll get our neighborhoods back. They're figuring we're smart enough to know that means they'll be taking the business away from the Corleones and Brasi, and that we'll be a part of whatever has to be done to accomplish that. And that means a bloody war, Rick said. We don't know what that means, Pete said. But I did tell the Rosatos that we wouldn't ever work with the likes of Luca Brasi. I made it clear, in fact, that we wanted to see Luca Brasi dead and burning in hell. And, Sean asked, his interest suddenly piqued. And he said, quote, if you hate Luca Brasi, it would behoove you to come to work for us. What the hell does that mean? Cork asked, speaking up for the first time. The men all looked at him as if they'd forgotten he was there. Luca is part of the Corleone family now. You can't go against Luca without going against the Corleones, so we're back where we started. Like Rick said, a war with the Corleones would be suicide for sure. If it's to be a war, Cork Gibson said, Rick and young Bobby here are right. We're no match for the Corleones. And if Mariposa's men are in on the fighting, then why would they need us? They've got all the goons they need to do the job themselves. Gentlemen, Pete said, and then laughed in a way that suggested a potent mixture of amusement and frustration. Gentlemen, he repeated, and he lifted his beer mug as if proposing a toast. I am not privy to the inner workings of the Rosato brothers or Jumpin' Joe Mariposa or any other Dago operation. I'm here to tell you the proposition as it was put to me. We go to work for them, we get our neighborhoods back. Part of the deal is that this is all on the QT. If they need something from us, we'll hear from them. That's the deal. We can take it or leave it. He finished the last of his beer and clapped the mug down on the bar. For sure they need something from us, Cor said, as if speaking to himself, though his eyes moved from face to face. To Pete, he said, I say if Luca Brasi winds up dead and buried and we wind up running the show in our own neighborhoods, then that's a deal we can't turn down. I'm in agreement, Pete said. We don't have to like the wop bastards to work with them. Sean said, without looking up from his beer, if I get to be the one puts a bullet in Luca Brasi, I'm with you. Jesus, Cork said. No matter how you cut it, you're talking about going up against the Corleones. Do you have a problem with that? Pete Murray asked. I do, Cork said. I've known Sonny and his family since I was in diapers. Stevie Dwyer leaned over the bar in Cork's direction. You might as well be a guinea yourself, Corcoran, he shouted. To the others, he said, I told you he don't belong with us. He's been sucking Sonny Corleone's dick since... Dwyer hadn't gotten the last word out of his mouth before Cork's beer mug hurled across the bar, caught him square on the forehead, and broke neatly in half along a seam in the glass. Stevie was partly knocked off his stool, and partly he jumped back, his hand flying up to his forehead, where a stream of blood gushed from a wide gash. Before he could regain his balance, Cork was on top of him, throwing punches, one of which, a wicked uppercut that caught him under the jaw, rendered him senseless. He went down rubbery-legged and wound up sitting against the barroom wall, his head dangling over his chest, and blood spilling onto his pants leg. The bar was quiet as Cork stepped back and away from Stevie, and when he looked around, he found the others unmoved from their places. Cork Gibson said, the Irish. We're a hopeless lot. Someone was bound to crack open that moron's head at some point, Pete said, sliding off his stool. He went to Bobby, put a hand on his back, and led him out of the bar. On the street, standing out in the sunlight in front of Patty's with the bright green shades over the bar's windows as backdrop, Pete tapped a cigarette out of a pack of Camels. He stared down at the image of a camel in the desert, and when he looked up, he lit the cigarette with his eyes on Bobby, 19. Vito waited in the back seat of the Essex, a raincoat folded over his lap, his fedora on top of the raincoat, his hands clasped in front of the fedora. Luca Brasi, seated alongside him, stared out the front window, past Sonny in the passenger seat, out onto 6th Avenue, where two young women were hurrying through the rain, each with a child in one hand and an open umbrella in the other.
The umbrellas were bright red in contrast to the day, which was gray and rainy. The men in the cars were silent, Sonny in the front seat with his fedora tilted over his eyes, Luca in the back with his twisted face unreadable and blank. Vito had sent their driver, Richie Gatto, out to take a stroll around the neighborhood. Genko, to walk off his nerves, had chosen to join him. They were in the garment district, parked on the corner of 6th Avenue and 30th. Above a shuttered newsstand on the corner, the side of a building had been turned into a massive billboard that pictured two blind children looking up to the words, "Your money makes the helpless blind able to help themselves." Beyond the blind children, over the tops of the surrounding roofs, the steeple of St. Francis rose up to a low ceiling of clouds, a bright cross at its pinnacle. Sonny checked his wristwatch, tilted his hat back off his forehead, and twisted around slightly, as if he wanted to say something to his father about the time. Instead, he sank back into his seat and pulled his hat down over his eyes again. Vito said,
"It's good to be a little late for a thing like this,"
just as Richie and Genko came around the corner of 7th Avenue and started toward the car. Richie wore a fedora pulled down low and the collar of his overcoat turned up against the rain, while Genko walked under a black umbrella. Both men looked from building to building as they walked, their eyes scouring entranceways and alleys. Genko, next to the bulk of Richie Gatto, looked as skinny as a stick figure.
"Nothing to worry about,"
Richie said as he slid into the driver's seat and started the car.
"Clemenza and Tessio?"
Vito asked.
"They're in their places,"
Genko said. He got into the back seat as Vito slid closer to Luca.
"If there's a commotion of any kind,"
Genko cocked his head, a gesture that suggested Clemenza and Tessio might see the commotion, but he questioned whether or not it would do any good.
"They've got their boys with them,"
Richie said, dismissing Genko's worry.
"If there's trouble, we're in good shape."
"There won't be any trouble," Vito said.
"This is just a precaution."
He glanced alongside him to Luca, who remained distant and removed, lost in whatever thoughts were left to him. In the front seat, Sonny straightened out his tie, the look on his face something between anger and annoyance. He hadn't said 2 words all morning.
"Sonny,"
Vito said,
"you walk behind Genko and keep your eyes open. Everybody will be sizing up everybody else at this meeting. What we say, what we do, how we appear, this is important. Understand?"
"Sure," Sonny said. "You want me to keep my mouth shut, Pop? I got it." Luca Brazzi, without any movement or change in the blank expression of his face, said,
"Mouth shut, eyes open."
Sonny glanced back at Luca. Alongside them on the street, a line of cars and trucks were stopped at a red light. The rain slowed to a misty drizzle. Once the light turned green and the traffic started moving, Richie waited for an opening and pulled out onto 6th. A minute later, he was pulling up behind a black Buick on the street outside the courtyard of St. Francis. A tall, fat man stuffed into a bright blue 3-piece suit waited at the wheel of the Buick, an elbow sticking out the window. In the courtyard garden, Carmine Rosato and Ettore Barzini were chatting with a couple of beat cops. One of the cops said something that made the other 3 men laugh, and then Carmine escorted them out of the courtyard, walking between them, a hand on each cop's elbow. Richie, who had come around to open the back door of the Essex for Genko, waved to Carmine and called out his name. The cops paused, watched Genko and Vito exit the car onto the sidewalk, and then moved on down the block, only to stop again suddenly at the sight of Luca Brazzi exiting the car. Ettore, who had followed Carmine out of the courtyard, clapped a hand on the shoulder of one of the cops and moved them along. Carmine joined Richie, Genko, and Vito on the sidewalk. Inside the courtyard, a couple of Emilio Barzini's men approached the gate and watched as Luca and Sonny joined the other men in a cluster beside the Essex. Barzini's men looked at each other and then disappeared along the path to the church. Carmine stepped closer to Richie.
"You bringing Luca Brazzi in there?"
Once inside the courtyard, Vito admired the arrangement of the gardens surrounding a concrete walkway to the church entrance. He paused by a 4-tiered fountain a dozen feet in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary with her hands held out, in her traditional pose, as if welcoming all who approached her, her grief-filled eyes still somehow loving. When Jenko came up beside him, Vito proceeded to the church with his consigliere by his side, Luca and Sonny following. Behind the glass entranceway doors in a small foyer, Emilio Barzini waited with his hands clasped at his waist. He shook hands with Vito and Jenko and ignored Luca and Sonny. "This way," he said, and led them through a second pair of glass doors that opened onto a wide corridor. "This is the shrine of St. Anthony," he added, as if he were there to give them a guided tour of the church. Vito and the others gazed through a central portal into a long, low-ceilinged room with lines of brightly polished pews on either side of a tiled aisle leading to a marble altar. Vito crossed himself, as did all the others, when they passed the altar, before continuing along the hushed corridor, following Emilio. "They're waiting for you," Emilio said. He stood aside and opened a heavy wooden door, beyond which 5 men sat at a long conference table. Vito identified all the men at a glance. At the head of the table, sitting in an ornate chair that looked comically like a throne with its plush red velvet stuffed back and armrests, Giuseppe Mariposa stared straight ahead, at nothing, showing his annoyance at Vito's late entry to the meeting. He was dressed immaculately, a tailored suit fitted to his still athletic body, his white hair parted neatly in the center. Facing Vito on the far side of the table were Anthony Stracci of Staten Island and Ottilio Cuneo, who ran all of upstate. On the near side of the table, next to Giuseppe and beside an empty chair obviously meant for Vito, Mike DeMeo, the balding, heavy-set boss of New Jersey's DeMeo family, fidgeted in his seat, his torso twisting this way and that, as if he couldn't get comfortable. At the opposite end of the table from Giuseppe, Philip Tattaglia tapped the ash off his cigarette as he looked up to Vito and Jenko. A bodyguard stood against the wall behind each of the men. Giuseppe's bodyguard, Tomasino Cinquemani, red-faced and breathing hard, was half turned away from the table, showing his back to Vito. "Forgive me," Vito said. He looked around the room again as if to assure himself of what he was seeing. Portraits of saints and priests decorated the walls, and 5 empty chairs were lined up against the wainscoting. At the back of the room, there was a second doorway. "It was my understanding," he said, "that our consiglieri were to be a part of this meeting." "You must have misunderstood," Giuseppe said, finally turning to look at him. He checked his wristwatch. "You got the time wrong, too." "Vito," Jenko said softly. He stepped close and began to speak quickly in Italian, trying to explain that there had not been a mistake. He noted the 5 empty chairs and guessed that Mariposa had sent out the rest of the consiglieri rather than have Jenko and Luca in the room. "Luca Brazzi!" Giuseppe barked, the name coming out like a curse. "Escort Jenko into the back room." He gestured toward the second doorway. "You can wait for us there with the others." Luca, standing directly behind Vito, gave no hint that he had heard Giuseppe. He waited comfortably, his hands dangling at his sides, his eyes on a bowl of fruit in the center of the long table. Behind Giuseppe, Tomasino turned and faced Luca. There were 2 discolorations of skin that ran in jagged lines under his eye, where Luca had pistol-whipped him. The scars burned red in comparison to the weathered olive skin surrounding them. Luca lifted his eyes from the bowl of fruit to meet Tomasino's eyes, and his face, for the first time, was animated slightly by the hint of a smile. Vito touched Luca and Jenko each on the elbow. "Andate," he said in a whisper that could still be heard throughout the room. "Go. I'll have Santino with me." Sonny, who had been standing with his back to the door, his face red but otherwise expressionless, moved closer to his father. Vito took his seat next to Mike DeMeo. When the door had closed behind Jenko and Luca, Giuseppe straightened out his shirt sleeves, tugged at the cuffs, and then pushed his chair back and stood up. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've asked you all to come here today so that we might avoid trouble in the future." The words came out stiff and rehearsed. He coughed and then went on, sounding a little more natural. Listen, he said, there's a lot of money to be made if we all keep our heads and cooperate with each other like businessmen, not like animals, he added, and he looked to the back door where Luca had just walked out. You all have your territories, he went on, and you're all bosses. Between us, we control New York and New Jersey, except for certain Jews and certain Irish, a bunch of mad dog fucking idiots who think they can do whatever they want and go wherever they please. He leaned closer to his audience. But we'll settle their hash later on, he said. Between the bosses and the bodyguards, there wasn't a sound. Everyone in the room looked bored, with the exception of Philip d'Italia, who seemed to be hanging on Giuseppe's every word. Now, Giuseppe continued, there's been too much killing. Some of it had to be, he said, and then, looking at Vito, added, and some of it didn't. That kid Nicky Crea in Central Park. He shook his head. It makes the cops and politicians angry, and then it makes trouble for all of us. Now, I say, you're all bosses of your families, you make the decisions, but I say when there's a death sentence for one of our own people. I say there should be a court of bosses to approve such a thing. That's one of the reasons I've called you together here, to see if you would all agree to that. Giuseppe stepped back from the Don Mariposa, he said, standing in his place. I respect your great strength in New York, especially now that the Leconte family businesses have been folded into your own. But New York, he added, his eyes lingering on Giuseppe's. New York, of course, is not New Jersey. Still, he said, anything that keeps us from killing each other like a bunch of madmen, that I support. He paused and then tapped a finger twice on the table. And if I support it, he said, you can count on the rest of New Jersey to support it. DeMeo sat down to a round of polite applause from all the bosses but Vito, who nonetheless seemed to be pleased by the New Jersey boss's speech. Then it's done, Giuseppe said, as if the applause were an official vote and the matter was resolved. Now I have one more problem, and then we can go and eat. He sat back in his seat. I've lost a lot of income with the repeal of Prohibition, he said. My family has lost a lot of money, and the men complain. He looked around the table. I'm here to speak plainly to you and to tell you the truth. My men want war. They want to expand our businesses into your territories, all of your territories. My men, they tell me we have grown so strong we would win such a war. They tell me it would only be a matter of time and we could be running all of New York, downstate and up and, he said, looking at Mike DeMeo, New Jersey. And then there would be money to replace the money we've lost to repeal. He paused again to pull his chair in closer to the table. There are many voices in my family that argue for this, but I say no. I don't want this war. I say I would have the blood of too many people on my hands, the blood of friends, of some people I hold in great respect, and a few people I love. I say again, I don't want this war. But you're all bosses, and you know how it is. If I try to go against the will of so many of my people, I won't be boss for long. And it is because of that, also, that I have asked you here. He stretched his open hands out over the tabletop. I'm saying, let us avoid the bloodshed and come to an agreement. You are all your own bosses, but with my strength, which I do not wish to use, I think I should be acknowledged as boss of all bosses. For that, I will be the one to judge all your disputes and to resolve them with force if need be. He stared across the table at Vito. And for that, he said, I should be paid. I will take a little something from all your enterprises, he said, almost as if he were talking to Vito alone. I will expect a percentage of all your earnings, he said, and then turned away from Vito to the others. A very small percentage, but from all of you. This will help me keep my people happy, and so we will avoid bloodshed. Finished saying his piece, Giuseppe leaned back in his chair and once again folded his arms over his chest. When several tense moments passed without a word, he nodded to Tatalia. "Philip," he said, "why don't you speak first?" Tatalia slapped both hands down on the table and stood to speak. "I welcome the protection of Don Mariposa," he said. "It makes good business sense. We pay a small percentage and save the cost of fighting a war, and who could ask for a better judge in our disputes than Don Mariposa?" Dressed in a flashy pale blue suit with a bright yellow tie, Tatalia tugged at his jacket, straightening it out. "I say this is a reasonable offer," he said, and took his seat again. "I think we should be grateful to avoid this war," he added. "A war which might have, God forbid, cost some of us our lives." Around the table, the bosses looked to each other, watching for reactions. Not a face at the table gave away a thing, though Anthony Strachey of Staten Island could not have been said to look happy, and Ottilio Caneo looked slightly pained, as if some physical discomfort were bothering him. Mariposa, at the head of the table, pointed to Vito. "Corleone," he asked, "what do you say?" Vito said, "What's the percentage?" "I have a small beak," Mariposa answered. "I ask only to wet it a little." "Excuse me, Signor Mariposa," Vito said, "but I would like a little more detail. Exactly what percentage are you requiring from all the bosses here at this table?" 15%, Giuseppe said to Vito. To the others, he said, "I'm asking as a man of honor and a man of business that you pay me 15% of all your operations." Turning back to Vito, he said, "I get 15% of your gambling operations, of your monopoly in the olive oil business, and of all your union business, just as Tatalia," he said, looking to the others, "has agreed to pay 15% of his woman business and his laundries." Back to Vito, he said, "Now, is that clear enough for you, Corleone?" "Si," Vito said. He folded his hands on the table and leaned toward Giuseppe. "Yes," he repeated. "Thank you, Don Mariposa. That is very clear and I think very reasonable." He looked to the others. As he finished speaking, the bosses all rose from their seats and joined Vito and Mariposa to shake hands. Vito looked to Sonny, who was holding the back door open, and from Sonny's face to Zhenko's in the next room, where he was standing with a dozen others around a banquet table piled high with food and drink. Zhenko seemed to read something in Vito's face. He turned to Luca, signaling with a nod that they were leaving. With Sonny, the men formed a little circle by the door and waited for Vito as he finished shaking hands and exchanging a few polite words with the rest of the bosses. Standing against the wall with his hands clasped in front of him like all the other bodyguards, Tomasino Cinquemani stared at Luca, his face growing red and the scars under his eye redder, before he turned away and calmed a little, his gaze resting on one of the portraits of the saints that lined the walls. In the back seat of the Essex, as Richie Gatto drove through Manhattan's streets under a steady rain, Vito placed his hat on the window shelf behind him and undid the top button on his shirt. The car was loud with an anticipatory silence, as if all the men, Sonny in the front with Richie and Vito in the back with Zhenko and Luca, were waiting for someone to speak first. Vito stroked his throat and closed his eyes. He appeared troubled. When he opened his eyes again, he turned to Luca, who at that moment turned to him. Though Zhenko sat between them, he might as well have been invisible as the two men looked at each other, each seeming to read something in the other's eyes. Sonny, who had been staring out the window at the rain, spoke first. He shouted, for Christ's sake!" startling everyone in the car but Luca, who alone didn't flinch. "Pop!" he said, and he twisted around so that he was kneeling as he looked into the back of the car. "I can't believe we took that crap from Mariposa, that fucking chooch. We're paying him 15%? "Santino," Vito said, and he laughed slightly. It was as if Sonny's outburst had dispelled the ominous mood that had settled over everyone.
Sonny, he said, sit still and be quiet. Unless someone asks you to speak, you have no voice here.
Sonny let his head drop dramatically to his chest. He clasped his hands behind his neck. Zhenko said, "You don't understand these things yet, Sonny." When Sonny nodded without looking up, Zhenko said to Vito, "Joe wants 15%.
He's to take 15% of everyone's business, and for this," Vito said to Zhenko, "he promises us there will be no war."
Zhenko pressed his hands together, palm to palm.
"What was the look on their faces?" he asked, when Joe told them what they had to pay. "They don't like it," Vito said, as if that was of course how they'd respond. "But they know it's cheaper than a war."
"They're scared," Luca said, with disgust for all the bosses that had been gathered together in that room.
"But they still don't like it," Zhenko said, "and that's good for us."
Vito smacked Sonny lightly on the head, telling him to straighten up and pay attention. Sonny lifted his head, looked into the back of the car, and then folded his arms over his chest and was quiet, mimicking Luca.
"Mariposa is greedy," Vito said to everyone. "That all the bosses know. When he comes after us, they'll know it's only a matter of time before he goes after them."
"I agree," Zhenko said, "and this too is in our favor."
"For now," Vito said, "we'll pay the 15%.
He looked out the front window over Sonny's head.
"In the meantime," he went on, "we continue to get ready. We could still use more politicians and cops on the payroll."
"Manage," Zhenko said. "Vito, we're already paying too many people. Some state senator asked me for $3,000 last week. I told him no. $3,000 vafanku."
"Call him back,"
Vito said softly, as if he was suddenly tired.
"And tell him yes. Tell him Vito Corleone insisted we show our friendship."
"But Vito," Zhenko said, and then was silenced when Vito raised his hand, ending the discussion.
"The more cops and judges we have on our payroll, the stronger we are. And I'm willing to show friendship first."
"Maron," Zhenko said, giving up the argument. "Half of what we take in, we pay out again."
"In the long run," Vito said, "trust me, Zhenko. That will be our greatest strength."
When Zhenko only sighed and then was silent, Vito turned to Sonny.
"We agreed to pay the 15%,
he said, going all the way back in the conversation to Sonny's initial objection.
"Because it doesn't matter, Santino. Mariposa called this meeting hoping I would object. He wanted me to refuse. Then, when he comes after us, the rest of the families will get the message."
Vito spoke as if he were Mariposa, giving him a whiny voice.
"I had no choice."
Sonny spun around and dropped down in his seat. He said, looking out the front window at the rain, "Can I ask one more question, consigliere?" When Zhenko didn't say no, Sonny asked, his frustration evident. "Again, how do we know for sure that Mariposa's coming after us whether or not we pay up?" Behind him, out of Sonny's sight, Zhenko looked to Vito and shook his head. Vito said,
"Here's a lesson for you, Sonny. Don't write if you can talk. Don't talk if you can nod your head. Don't nod your head if you don't have to."
In the back seat, Zhenko looked at Vito with a smile. Sonny, in the front seat, shrugged and was quiet. Cork lay on his back in the fading light of a rainy spring day, with Caitlin stretched out on top of him asleep, her head pressed into his neck, her feet resting on his hips. He had one arm folded under the back of his head, and the other resting on the child's shoulder, where he had patted her to sleep after reading to her, for the 100th time, the story of Conla and the Fairy Maiden, a tale out of one of his father's old books, a leather-bound, gilt-edged collection of stories that lay beside him now on Caitlin's narrow bed. Carefully, he turned on his side and slid Caitlin onto the sheets, her head surrounded by a nimbus of sandy blonde hair resting on a lumpy pillow. Outside, A key turned in the lock, and the kitchen door opened just as he pulled a checkered quilt of farm animals over Caitlin's shoulders. He waited beside his sleeping niece for a minute in the darkening room and listened to Eileen as she moved about the kitchen. Cork had been a child himself in this apartment. He'd been so young when the flu took both his parents that he had few memories of them, but he remembered clearly the excitement of moving into these rooms with Eileen. He had his 7th birthday in the kitchen. Eileen, who must have then been about his age now, strung red and yellow crepe paper banners across the ceiling and invited every kid on the block. She had just taken the bakery job with Mrs. McConaughey, who seemed ancient to him even then. He remembered Eileen shouting, "A 3-bedroom with a living room and kitchen," and thinking to himself that they were moving into a palace, which the apartment was compared to the cramped rooms they'd been sharing in the houses of distant relatives, while Eileen finished high school to the displeasure of at least a few of those relatives. He'd grown up in this apartment and moved out himself only when he finished high school and started pulling jobs with Sonny. Now that was over, and Murray'd told him to stay clear of the Irish. Cork looked around his old bedroom and found the feel of the place comforting, the familiar street sounds beyond the window, the pleasant noise of Eileen puttering through the rooms. From the floor beside Caitlin's bed, he picked up Boo, her poor tattered giraffe, and placed it in her arms. He found Eileen at the sink finishing up a few dishes. "I was just thinking about old Mrs. McConaughey," he said, and he pulled up a seat at the table. "Is she still going?" "Is she still alive?" Eileen said as if surprised by the question. She turned around, drying her hands on a bright green dish towel. "Sure," she said. "Doesn't she still send me cards twice a year on Easter and Christmas? She's a saint, the woman is." "She was funny," Cork said. "She always had a riddle for me." He paused, remembering the old woman, and then added, "You think I might get a cup of coffee as reimbursement for my babysitting services?" "You might," Eileen said, and went about putting up the coffee. "I remember the big party we had for her here," Cork said, returning to the subject of Mrs. McConaughey. "Are you feeling nostalgic then?" Eileen asked, with her back to him. "I can't recall you ever mentioning Mrs. McConaughey before." "I suppose I am," Cork said. "A little anyway." He took in the kitchen ceiling, remembering the bright crepe paper banners of his 7th birthday. The party for Mrs. McConaughey had been to celebrate her retirement and her impending return home to Ireland. Eileen and Jimmy had just bought the bakery from her. "I've been thinking," he said, "with all the babysitting I do for Caitlin, I might as well be living here again." "You mean you're not living here?" Eileen said. She faced him, her hands on her hips. "How come I see you every time I turn around, morning and night? Except, of course, when I'm in the shop working like a slave to keep food on the table. Then God knows where you are and what you're doing." "Nothing much," Cork said. "Not recently, anyway." He looked away from Eileen and then down at his own hand where it lay on the table. "Bubby," Eileen asked, "is there something the matter?" She pulled up a seat and placed her hand over his. For a while, the only sound was the simmer of coffee heating up in the pot, and then Cork said, "I was thinking, what if I moved back in and went to work with you in the bakery?" Cork knew this was something that Eileen dearly wanted, that she had pushed for since long before he'd finished high school, but he posed the question as if it were a new idea, a possibility that had just occurred to him. "Are you serious?" Eileen asked, and she yanked her hand away from him, as if something about the question frightened her. "I am," Cork said. "I have some money saved. I could help out." Eileen got up to attend the coffee. 20. Sonny walked beside Sandra past the bakeries and delicatessens of Arthur Avenue. On the street, cars and trucks zipped around peddlers' carts as kids in knickers and short-sleeved shirts ran along the sidewalk and through traffic fearlessly, the summery spring day drawing children and adults alike outdoors. Sonny had parked his car in front of Sandra's building and walked with her to Coluccio's butcher shop, and now they were walking back, a string of sausage wrapped in heavy white paper and tied with cord dangling from Sonny's fingertips. Sandra wore a floppy green hat with a white band over dark hair that came down to her shoulders. The hat was new and too fancy for her plain white dress, but Sonny had complimented her a dozen times already in their short walk to pick up sausage for her grandmother. "You know who you look like?" he said with a big smile as he turned to walk backward in front of her. "You look like Kay Francis in Trouble in Paradise." "I do not," Sandra said. She shoved him, the flat of her hand hitting his shoulder. "Only much prettier," Sonny added. "Kay Francis can't hold a candle to you." Sandra crossed her arms over her chest and cocked her head as she appraised Sonny's looks. He had on gray pinstriped slacks, a dark shirt, and a black and gray striped tie. "Nobody else looks like you," she said, and then, blushing, added, "You're better looking than all those guys in the movies." Sonny threw back his head and laughed, and then turned around again to walk beside her. On the corner in front of them, an organ grinder was setting up to play, and already a throng of kids surrounded him. A stout, short man in a bowler hat with a bright red bandana around his neck, the organ grinder looked like he was newly landed in America, with his thick mustache and wings of gray hair flying out from under his hatband. His organ was old and battered, held together with tattered belts. Prancing atop it on a blue pad and ringing a tiny silver bell was a small monkey dressed in pants and a leathery jacket. A bright, thin chain looped from its neck to the organ grinder's wrist. "You want to stop a minute?" Sonny asked. Sandra shook her head and looked at her feet. "You're worried about your grandmother," Sonny said. "Listen," he added, and then hesitated as a great cloud of sparrows swooped low and came together over the rooftops before soaring up the avenue. "Listen," he repeated, and suddenly his voice caught a little as if he were nervous. "Johnny and Nino are playing at a fancy supper club tonight. I'd like to take you out to eat there, and then afterward we could go dancing. What if I could get your grandmother to let you go?" "You know she won't." "What if I could convince her?" "That'd be the day," Sandra said. "And anyway," she added, "I don't have the proper clothes. You'd be ashamed of me." "That couldn't be," Sonny said. "But anyway, I already considered this." "Considered what?" Sandra asked. They turned the corner off Arthur Avenue and onto her block. "That you need some fancy clothes." Sandra looked at Sonny with confusion. "Hey," Sonny said, "look at that." He hurried past Sandra and onto the street, where a bright blue convertible Cord with its long hood and white-walled tires was already attracting a crowd. "Fancy car," Sandra said, coming up alongside him. "It's got front-wheel drive," Sonny said. "Uh-huh," Sandra answered, clearly having no idea what Sonny was talking about. "Do you think you'd like to have a car like this?" Sonny asked. "You're funny today," Sandra said, and she tugged him by the arm back onto the sidewalk. Sonny said, "I don't mean to be funny, Sandra." They were near her building now, where his Packard was parked on the street. "I think we should have dinner together tonight where Johnny and Nino are playing, and then go out dancing after." Mrs. Colombo, leaning out her window, yelled down to Sandra, "Hey, what took you so long?" Sonny waved to Mrs. Colombo, handed the sausage to Sandra, and then leaned through the open passenger window of his car and pulled out a bulky brown paper package tied up with white string. "What's this?" Sandra asked. "A fancy dress and shoes and other stuff for you." He handed her the package. Sandra looked up to her grandmother, who was peering down at her and Sonny with her hands on her chin. "Open it," Sonny said. Sandra took a seat on her stoop. She placed the package in her lap, untied the string, and peeled open the brown paper only enough to see the shimmering silk fabric of an evening gown before she slapped it closed and looked up to her grandmother. "Sandra!" Mrs. Colombo called, looking worried. "You come up here right now." "We're coming," Sandra called back. To Sonny, she whispered, "Have you gone mad, Santino?" She stood and handed him back the package. "It looks so expensive," she said. "Grandma will faint if she sees it." "I don't think so," Sonny said. "You don't think so? Come on." Sonny put his hand on Sandra's back and directed her up the stairs. At the door, Sandra said again, worriedly, "It looks so expensive, Sonny." Sonny said, "I get a good salary now." "Working in a garage?" She opened the door and waited for Sonny to answer before stepping into the dim foyer. "I don't work in a garage anymore," Sonny said. I'm working for my father now. Giuseppe Mariposa gazed out the curved corner window of an apartment on the top floor of a building on 25th Street in Manhattan. In the late afternoon light, he saw his own reflection and beyond it, at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue, the towering triangle of the Flatiron Building. Against the dark sky, the white limestone surface of the Flatiron's topmost floors looked like an arrow soaring over the traffic and the trolleys and the Fifth Avenue double-deckers bustling through Madison Square. The day's weather had been erratic, with quick, powerful thunderstorms flashing through the city, leaving behind bright sunshine and glistening streets. Now, it was cloudy again, an edgy, electric cloudiness that promised another storm. Behind Giuseppe, a spacious 5-bedroom apartment was bare, a maze of rooms with bright hardwood floors and freshly painted white walls through which the Rosatos and the Barzinis and Frankie Pentangeli and few of their boys wandered around looking things over, the noise of their conversations and the creak of their footsteps bouncing through the hallways and the empty rooms. At the sight of Frankie's reflection in the window, Giuseppe spun around. "Frankie," he said, "where the hell's the goddamn furniture? This is no good if we got a hole up here. What are you thinking?" Frankie squinted at Giuseppe as if he couldn't quite see him clearly. "What?" he said. Emilio Barzini appeared in the doorway, his boy Tits at his side. Tits was a good-looking kid, not yet 21, but pudgy, with a big circle of a face and a flabby chest that got him his nickname. He dressed in the same 3-piece suits as Emilio, whom he'd been working for in one capacity or another since he was 12. But the same suits that looked crisp and snappy on Emilio looked baggy and rumpled on Tits. Awkward as the kid looked, he was serious and smart, and Emilio kept him close. "Hey, Giuseppe," Frankie said when Mariposa stared at him and said nothing, his hands on his hips. "You said, find a place, rent the top floor. That's what I did." "What did you think I'd rent the place like this for, Frankie?" "How do I know, Joe? You didn't say anything about holding up here. Are you telling me we're going to war?" "Did I say we're going to war?" "Hey, Joe," Frankie said. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and stood his ground. "Don't treat me like a Strones." Before Giuseppe could speak, Emilio took a few steps into the room. "Frankie," he said, "don't go getting your feelings hurt." He moved between Frankie and Giuseppe, who were squared off, facing each other. "Sometimes, the fewer people know things, the better. That's all. Right, Joe?" When Mariposa nodded, Frankie said, "Fine." To Emilio, he said, "Hey, I don't need to know everything." To Giuseppe, he said, "You want me to fix the place up like we're going to war? Get food, get some furniture in here, bring in some mattresses, do all that? Just tell me. I'll have my boys take care of it." He paused and added, "But be reasonable. You gotta tell me. I can't read minds." Giuseppe looked first to Tits and Emilio, and then to Frankie. All the other rooms had gone quiet, and he imagined the Rosatos and the rest of the boys listening. When he turned to Frankie, he said,